Designing a research study. The learning objectives for this section are: 1. Define the concept of a variable, distinguish quantitative from categorical variables, and give examples of variables that might be of interest to psychologists. 2. Explain the difference between a population and sample. 3. Distinguish between experimental and non-experimental research. And 4. Distinguish between lab studies, and field experiments. Variables and operational definitions. Part of generating a hypothesis involves identifying the variables that you want to study and operationally defining those variables so that they can be measured. Research questions in psychology are about variables. A variable is a quantity or a quality that varies across people or situations. So for example, the height of the students enrolled in a college course is a variable because it varies from one student to another. The chosen major of the students is also a variable, just as long as not everybody in the class has the same major. Almost everything in our world varies, and as such, thinking of examples of characteristics or of things that are constants, things that don't vary, is a lot more difficult. So for example, being human, if we're talking about humans in our research, that's not considered a variable because everybody will have the same value. That is a constant. All of the participants are human. A rare example in terms of science, more sciencey science, you may think of hard science, is the constant, the speed of light. So the speed of light has been shown to always be the same speed. It does not vary, therefore it's a constant, not a variable. Variables can be either quantitative or categorical. A quantitative variable is a quantity, such as height, that is typically measured by assigning a number to each individual. Other examples of quantitative variables include people's level of talkativeness, how depressed they are, and the number of siblings they have. A categorical variable is a quality, such as a chosen major, and is typically measured by assigning a category label to each individual. So for example, psychology, English, or nursing majors. Other examples include people's nationality, their occupation, and whether they're receiving psychotherapy. Now, it's important to note that even though we sometimes attach numbers to these categories, those numbers don't reflect meaningful quantities. So for example, you may have a survey where you ask for ethnicity, and you have 1 is American, 2 is Asian, 3 is Hispanic, 4 is Black, and so on. Now, those numbers just represent the category. It doesn't mean that Asians are 2 times Americans in any sort of way. After the researcher generates their hypothesis and reflects the variables they want to manipulate and measure, the researcher needs to find ways to actually measure the variable of interest. This requires an operational definition. This is a definition of the variable in terms of precisely how it is going to be measured. Most variables that researchers are interested in studying can't be directly observed or measured, and this poses a problem because empiricism, which is based on observation, is at the heart of the scientific method. Operationally defining a variable involves taking an abstract construct, like depression, that can't be directly observed, and transforming it into something that can be directly observed and measured. Most variables can be operationally defined in many different ways. So for example, depression could be operationally defined as people's scores on a paper and pencil depression test, a scale, such as the Beck Depression Inventory. It could also be defined as the number of depressive symptoms they're experiencing. Or it could be whether they have been diagnosed with major depressive disorder. Researchers are wise to choose an operational definition that has been used extensively in the research literature because, again, this lends credibility to your work. Using similar operational definitions, and it also makes it easier to compare your results with the results from studies that have a similar or the same operational definition. sampling and measurement. In addition to identifying which variables to manipulate and measure, and operationally defining those variables, researchers need to identify the population of interest. Researchers in psychology are usually interested in drawing conclusions about some very large group of people. This is called the population. This could be all American teenagers, or it could be children with autism, could be professional athletes, or even just human beings. Really, it depends on the interests and the goals of the researcher. However, researchers usually don't study an entire population. They usually study only a small subset or a sample of the population. For example, a researcher might measure the talkativeness of a few hundred college students with the intention of drawing a conclusion about the talkativeness of men and women in general. It's important, therefore, for researchers to use a representative sample, one that's similar to the population in important respects. Students always ask me if it's possible to get a truly representative sample. The answer is not really. Not usually, anyway. Social scientists have developed a sort of compromise, which is to do your best to get a sample that matches your population of interest on the characteristics that are most meaningful to the study. A common way of trying to achieve this compromise is by using random sampling. One method of obtaining a sample is simple random sampling, in which every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected for the sample. For example, a pollster could start with a list of all the registered voters in a city, which would be the population, randomly select 100 of them from the list, the sample, and ask those 100 people whom they intend to vote for. Unfortunately, random sampling is difficult or impossible in most psychological research because the populations are less clearly defined than the registered voters in a city. How could a researcher give all American teenagers or all children with autism an equal chance of being selected for a sample? It's just not feasible. It's not possible in many cases. The most common alternative to random sampling is convenience sampling. So in convenience sampling, the sample consists of individuals who happen to be nearby and willing to participate, such as introductory psychology students. The most common participants used in psychological research are rats and undergraduate students. The reason so many students use undergraduate students as participants is not because scientists think students represent everybody, but because they're a captive audience. At four-year universities, where faculty members and graduate students conduct research, it is very common for undergraduate students in lower-level psychology classes to participate in a certain number of research hours as a participant in order to fulfill a requirement for their course. This means that there are always participants available for the researchers. Of course, the obvious problem with convenience sampling is that the sample might not be representative of the population, and therefore it may be less appropriate to generalize the results from the sample to the population. I don't know why that did that. Experimental versus non-experimental research. The next step a researcher must take is to decide which type of approach they'll use to collect the data. As we'll learn in this research methods class, there are many different approaches to research that can be divided in many different ways. One of the most fundamental distinctions is between experimental and non-experimental research. Experimental research. Researchers who want to test hypotheses about causal relationships, that one thing causes another, so about causal relationships between variables, i.e. their goal is to explain, need to use an experimental method. This is because the experimental method is the only method that allows us to determine causal relationships. Using the experimental approach, Researchers first manipulate one or more variables while attempting to control extraneous variables. And then they measure how the manipulated variables affect participants' responses. The terms independent variable and dependent variable are used in the context of experimental research. The independent variable is the variable the experimenter manipulates. It is the presumed cause. And the dependent variable is the variable the experimenter then measures. It's the presumed effect. Extraneous variables are any variable other than the dependent variable. Confounds are a specific type of extraneous variable that systematically varies along with the variables under investigation and therefore provides an alternative explanation for the results. When researchers design an experiment, they need to ensure that they control for confounds. They need to ensure that extraneous variables, those outside variables, don't become confounding or confusing variables, because in order to make a causal conclusion that the independent variable manipulation is causing changes in the dependent variable outcome, they need to control for those confusing extra variables to make sure that alternative explanations for the results have been ruled out. So as an example, if we manipulate the lighting in the room and examine the effects of that manipulation on workers' productivity, then the lighting conditions, bright lights versus dim lights, would be considered the independent variable, because that's what we're manipulating. And the workers' productivity would be considered the dependent variable, because that's what we think depends on whether the lights are bright or dim. If the bright lights are noisy, for example, if you've ever been in a room where the lights are making a loud buzzing noise, then that would be a confound, since the noise would be present whenever the lights are bright, and the noise would be absent when the lights are dim. If the noise is varying systematically with the light, then we wouldn't know if a difference in worker productivity across the two lighting conditions is due to the bright lights and the dim lights, or the annoying noise and the no noise. So confounds are bad. They disrupt our ability to make causal conclusions about the nature of the relationship between variables. However, if there is noise in the room, both when the lights are on and when the lights are off, then noise is merely an extraneous variable. It's merely a variable other than our independent or dependent variable, but we don't necessarily have to worry that much about that extraneous variable because it's not varying systematically with our manipulation of the independent variable. So unless a variable varies systematically with the manipulated independent variable, it cannot be a competing explanation for the results. Non-experimental research. Researchers who are simply interested in describing characteristics of people, describing relationships between variables, and using those relationships to make predictions can use non-experimental research. Using the non-experimental approach, the researcher simply measures variables as they naturally occur, but they do not manipulate them. For instance, if I just measured the number of traffic fatalities in America last year that involved the use of a cell phone, but I didn't actually manipulate cell phone use, then this would be categorized as non-experimental research because I didn't manipulate anything. Alternatively, if I stood at a busy intersection and recorded drivers' genders and whether or not they're using cell phone when they pass through the intersection to see whether men or women are more likely to use a cell phone when driving, then this would be non-experimental research. It's important to point out that non-experimental does not mean non-scientific. Non-experimental research is scientific in nature. It can be used to fulfill two of the three goals of science: to describe and to predict. However, unlike with experimental research, we cannot make causal conclusions using this method. We cannot say that one variable causes another variable to change using non-experimental designs. Laboratory versus field research. The next major distinction between research methods is between laboratory and field studies. A laboratory study is a study that is conducted in the laboratory environment. In contrast, a field study is a study that is conducted in the real world, in a natural environment. Laboratory experiments typically have high internal validity. Internal validity refers to the degree to which we can confidently infer a causal relationship between variables. When we conduct an experimental study in a laboratory experiment or in a laboratory environment, we have very high internal validity because we manipulate one variable while controlling all other outside extraneous variables. When we manipulate an independent variable and observe an effect on a dependent variable, if we've controlled for everything else so that the only difference between our experimental groups or conditions and the one manipulated variable, then we can be quite confident that it is the independent variable that is causing the change in the dependent variable. So in other words, if everything else is equal except one group gets the manipulation and one group does not, then if we see a difference between the groups, we could draw the conclusion that it was that manipulation that caused the difference because everything else was the same. There is typically a trade-off between internal and external validity. External validity refers to the degree to which we can generalize the findings to other circumstances or settings, like real-world environments. When internal validity is high, external validity tends to be low. And when internal validity is low, external validity tends to be high. So, laboratory studies are typically low in external validity, while field studies are typically high in external validity. Since field studies are conducted in the real-world environment, it's far more appropriate to generalize the findings to that real-world environment than when the research is conducted in the more artificial, sterile laboratory. Finally, there are field studies which are non-experimental in nature because nothing is manipulated. But there are also field experiments where an independent variable is manipulated, it's in a natural setting, and extraneous variables are controlled. Depending on their overall quality and the level of control of extraneous variables, such field experiments can have high external and high internal validity.